What's up? Hi, everyone. My name is Joel Martinez. I was recently a postdoc at Harvard's Data Science Initiative and Department of Psychology. I am now an ex-academic. I have left academia to start a different career path. What I wanted to leave behind was this talk, which was my job talk that I gave when I tried the academic market last year. And I really think that this is a message that needs to be heard by a lot of psychologists. And so I'm hoping that this spreads widely and that there's something that you learn from it. A lot of this is a general overview of the work I did as a grad student, but also as a postdoc, thinking deeply and interdisciplinarily about how race is reified in a lot of the way that we do our science, whether you want it to be or not. So I'm going to go ahead and start. So I want to quickly say that I owe a great gratitude to two sisters, Karen and Barbara Fields, who developed the concept of Racecraft, which I really think is needed in the field of psychology. In this talk, I'm going to share my research journey and the insights that they inspired when I applied their concept to my own work and to psychology's scientific practices more generally. So hopefully by the end of this talk, you'll find something useful. You'll find something that you can chew on and really think about and hopefully apply to your own research and help me change the field. So I'd like to start with a story. This is the relationship between racism and race that you might learn from common social psych papers. Here, I'm going to simplify the story a bit, but it advocates for race realism, the idea that races are real in some way. And this is actually a stance that happens to be shared by research in very different areas like IQ differences, prejudice reduction, race relations, racial identity, etc. In one version of the story, there are biological substrates, usually talked about in terms of genetic clusters, that produce real races. We know that this story has been repeatedly fought against and rejected within social psychology, but it's a bit of a zombie. It always surfaces, it's always kind of there, and even to this day. The second version of the story is that there are social processes, usually talked about in terms of identity or culture, that produce real races. Subsequently, it's the relations or interactions between these races that produce racism at interpersonal or larger levels. Given the directionality emphasized in this story, a lot of effort has really been placed on trying to create these harmonious race relations. Social psychology is really big on this. Here in this space, race is assumed to be separable from racism, that we could work towards a world with races and racial identities, but without racism. I'd actually like to share an alternative story. This is a race anti-realist story where races do not exist. Technically, this story starts with structuring forces which are beyond the scope of this talk, like colonialism, capitalism, Sylvia Wynter's work on the human, all sorts of important historical and current modes of being in the world. However, that's beyond the scope of this talk, so we're going to talk about one of their products, which is racism. And here, I am going to follow the Field sisters and say that racism is the practice of applying social, civic, or legal double standards based on ancestry and other racialized features that people might have. So racism not only produces the consequences of race, it produces the belief in the reality of races. However, in this story, races do not exist, they're illusory. So we'll call the groups that are made by racism racialized groups instead. This terminological switch from race, which is more like a trait, something you are, it's decontextualized, it's always kind of there, to racialization, which is an action that's done to us, forces us to not take these groupings for granted and to always investigate the racialization process. Here, it's racist practices that place significance on contextually shifting sets of features that are then used to sort people into these illusory races. Features that are used or have been used or still used include genetics, ancestry, phenotype, speech, language, nationality, religion, legal documents, material possessions, physical environments that people inhabit and live in. All sorts of things get used. And finally, given the title of the talk, Racecraft is the ideological maneuvers that help naturalize the sorting process, as if races were biologically or socially real. This is similar to how witchcraft ideology conjures witches amongst us. Racecraft conjures races amongst us. Important to note, here, race is not separable from racism. Without racism, we don't have race, at least in the way we currently think of it. And I also want to note that this anti-realist story is not the same as colorblindness. Colorblindness rejects the idea of race because it rejects the idea of racism. Anti-realism rejects the idea of race, that it's real, but it understands that racism plays an important role in structuring our daily lives and experiences. So clearly this anti-realist story has different implications for psychology than the realist one. So why should we worry about how racecraft taints our everyday reasoning? Well, the Field sisters would say that racecraft transforms racism, something an aggressor does, into race, something the target is, in a sleight of hand that is easy to miss. So I want to give you an example of this from a political psychology paper I read. It says, because undocumented immigrants are disproportionately poorly educated and low skilled, as many as 1/3 of them are concentrated in low skill and low wage service occupations. So, in explaining the conditions of illegalized immigrants, racism and imperialism disappear from the story, even though they're involved in creating illegality and its consequences. Instead, those consequences get transformed into traits of illegalized immigrants, and then they become circular explanations of the consequences themselves. You can see that very clearly here. So this is what racecraft is. It's this ideological maneuver that treats something an aggressor does and turns it into something someone is, the target. So another way to think about racecraft's impact is to imagine a world where witches exist and another one where they don't. And you, as a scholar who's really interested in magic, you want to study perceptions of witches. In the world where they exist, you would ask very specific questions like, how accurate are people at perceiving witches? What behaviors or features truly make a witch? And are there any kind of witchy psychological differences that we might tap into? If this seems silly to you, it's because maybe we live in this other world where witches are understood to not exist. And so we tend to ask very different questions, right? We tend to ask things like, how are beliefs in witches constructed? What social practices propagate beliefs in witches? And how are people differentially, witchified, meaning like misperceived or thought to be a witch? Now what we're going to do is we're going to replace the word witch with race. And maybe you'll start to notice that a lot of psychology currently looks like this world, where we ask questions like, how accurate are people at perceiving different races? What features or behaviors truly make a race or distinguishes it from another? And are there any racial psychological differences that we should be finding? But the racecraft perspective would actually suggest we live in this other world where we need to ask very different questions than the ones we currently do. We need to ask things like, how are beliefs in race constructed? What social practices propagate beliefs in race? And how are people differentially racialized, meaning misperceived to belong to a race? And what are the consequences of that? So seeing the dangers of racecraft made me wonder, how do we study racialized groups without engaging in racecraft and reifying race? Another way to think about this is, what could a race anti-realist social psychology look like? I've spent a lot of time now thinking about this question and how racecraft manifests in various components of the research process. For instance, in our study designs, in how we use and interpret stimuli that are meant to represent specific racialized groups, such as faces. It also happens in our analyses, in how we rely on averages to summarize people while neglecting variation. And it also happens theoretically, in how we over-rely on social categories to explain psychological phenomenon versus the processes that are creating the categories in the first place. I'll be using this as a map to take y'all on a brief tour of racecraft in psychological science. And at the end, I'm going to provide some preliminary ideas for how we might counter it using one of my projects as an example. So the first stop on this tour is study design. And I'm focusing on faces because they're used by psychologists as the main visual stimuli for understanding stereotyping and prejudice, since consequential judgments are often made about others' faces before any actual social interaction. Also, there's just a lot of everyday physiognomic assumptions about the informative value of faces in everyday life, especially when it comes to race. Some examples include the way we try to investigate each other's true race, the way we try to trace population lineages in order to draw racial boundaries. And the stakes get even higher when it's done scientifically. For instance, when genetic evidence is used to predict facial phenotypes of suspects, which is currently used by many police departments. I do work with faces. So when I read Racecraft, it pushed me to really reconsider how I was interpreting the faces I was studying. So it got me thinking about how forms of this happen in the field of social perception. So currently, faces are chosen in some way where they're meant to visually represent racial groups, right? You might create or collect a set of Black, white, Asian, or mixed race faces. You might create a racial continuum between races. You might even create a morph between races, right? These faces are then shown in a task or an analysis. These could include things like trait ratings, implicit associations, economic games, memory and attention tasks, machine learning algorithms, neural decoding. I mean, really any task or analysis. What we do is we collect responses to these faces, and then the results are interpreted like the white faces showed this pattern of results and the Black faces showed this other pattern. What I would like to point out is how Facecraft manifests in these study designs. I define Facecraft as a mode of doing research. It's the practices and supporting ideologies like Racecraft that mobilize faces and their features to serve as evidence for the realness of social categories, and this is important, while obscuring the processes that map categories back onto those faces. So many of the procedures in these study designs operate from the assumption that race is read from a face, instead of understanding that race is read into a face, right? And this happens in the way that faces are initially chosen and how their researcher assigned race is assumed to remain static and congruently perceived by everyone, so that these later result interpretations seem reasonable to make, and you end up publishing them. But there's a lot of issues with these assumptions, right? The first is that multiple racializations can occur within the experimental context. The researchers have their own ideas or expectations of what the faces represent, but so do the participants, and they can disagree with the researchers, but they can also disagree with each other, right? So there's multiple racializations happening. We also know that human biodiversity is not binned into racial categories, which then suggests facial diversity isn't either. And this is shown the most clearly by research on skin tone, as shown by all the work on colorism. And so, this suggests that there's plenty of facial variation within race categories. And all of this variation then ensures that similar features can occur across race categories, right? How facial variation and exists and how it's then differentially racialized or mapped onto race categories problematizes the idea that race categories must exclusively look a particular way. The last point I want to make is that the same face can be dynamically reclassified based on the context. If you change the face's surrounding or change the face diet that someone consumes from their environments, that could change how a face is classified. This dynamism problematizes the idea that once a classification is assigned, that it's going to remain stable for everyone. So what are the solutions here, right? How do we ensure that the face represents what we need it to? There are solutions in the literature that try to do this. The first approach is that researchers ask for the racial identity of the people whose faces they're using, and then they're going to use those responses as the race of that face. Another approach is to rely on normed ratings from a previous sample and use those ratings to assign the race of the face, which is often used in face databases. Or you might even just have the participants rate the faces themselves. However, each of these solutions have critical issues that we need to consider. The identity approach takes for granted the congruence between someone's racialized self-identity, how they self-identify, their own facial appearance, and how they're going to be classified by others. And this is all reflected here in the red question marks. How one might actually classify themselves racially doesn't exclusively depend on appearance, right? If you become incarcerated, if you want to signal a political allegiance, you might actually change how you racially identify. If you want to, access some benefits that are only accessible to some people, that might change how you identify. So these dynamics complicate any kind of general relationships between physical appearance and someone's own racial identity or how they identify. And so, another way to say this is that the face is just one ingredient in the racialization process. But when we treat all of these aspects as necessarily congruent, that they all match, we're misunderstanding how racialization works. And then that becomes a form of racecraft. The norm rating approach takes for granted the congruence between the racial schemas of the norming sample, the previous sample, and the current sample. So recent work from me, Alex Todorov, and others suggests that many trait ratings of faces show plenty of disagreement, where ratings are less determined by the faces themselves and more determined by who's looking at the faces. This is a problem for relying on normed ratings. When the current sample disagrees with the previous norming sample, which is not often checked, the normed ratings can then start to dictate how the current sample should interpret the faces, right? The normed ratings suggest this is what a black face looks like. This is what a white face looks like. And so when we use the normed ratings to decide what the race of the face is, without checking whether our current sample actually shares that idea of race, then we start engaging in racecraft. The final approach is the race ratings approach, which takes race perception for granted, and specifically that it occurs through official race categories. Our race measures often depend on institutionalized categories, like from the census. But we know that people can accept, reject, or modify official categories for themselves and others. Therefore, there is no standard for choosing category options. The ratings that we collect are going to change depending on what options we provide, whether that's Latina versus brown versus Mexican versus other. And even if we figure out a reasonable set of options, the ratings then become a classification problem. Every face that in any data set I've worked with will definitely have some variation in how it's classified by people. So how do we as researchers decide what the perceived race of each face is? Do we take the average? Do we take the most given classification? We could, but that's a researcher decision that imposes a specific race category on that face by collapsing that rating variation. And that becomes another form of racecraft. So the bottom line here is that we have very open questions here about how we should study faces without reproducing racecraft. There are methods that are waiting to be developed that would not only help face researchers, but any researcher who's studying racialized stimuli. So ultimately, what face researchers can start to think about is that race is not in the eye of the beholder, nor is it on the body of the objectified. Perceiving race is a mode of perception that's regulated by colonially inherited racist practices, and is therefore an effect of a regime of social power, which means that the face is not the real or necessary origin of a person's race, as it's often treated in social perception designs. It's really just one canvas among many that's used for racializing us. So we need to realize that racialization as a process is not something that we investigate as detached and objective observers, right? This is a process that we as researchers are actively participating into. So that's the first step on the tour. That's how racecraft can manifest in our study designs. But now let's look and see how it can manifest in our analyses. Reading the book got me thinking about the assumptions about race I was making when I estimated statistics like race averages. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you the common average analysis that's used to summarize the perceptions or psychologies of racial categories. And then I'm going to show you a twist on that analysis that reveals problems with it. So for this project, we collected antagonistic tweets against immigrants during racist events in 2017. This was during the initial Muslim ban and discussions of building a wall along the US-Mexico border. Here are some example tweets. We're very close to having people from Pakistan banned from America. Love it. America first, F everyone else. Let those savages fend for themselves. Things you could fund instead of education or healthcare for illegals, those things. As a legal immigrant and proud US citizen, contributing in the workforce, my tax money ought to be used for America first. So you could see some of the tweets are more aggressive and some are more politically framed, right? So we showed these tweets to people and asked them to rate them on a scale of 1 to 9, how racist they were, 9 being the most racist. In some studies, the likes and retweets were blacked out, as you can see on the screen. In other studies, we manipulated the tweets to be more or less popular. We also sampled strategically for each study. We collected about 100 self-identifying white, Black, and Latinx participants from Qualtrics samples. And the prediction that I put up here, based on race theorizing in social and political and psychology, is that members of different racial groups will perceive racism in these tweets differently. Specifically, that white participants are going to say these tweets are less racist or not racist compared to Black and Latinx participants. This is presumably or theoretically because they're motivated to defend their superior position in a racial hierarchy or defend their nationalist interests in the United States. So what I'm going to show you is the common average analyses that are used in these kinds of rating studies. The y-axis here is the racism rating. The x-axis is the racial category. And below that is the sample size we collected for each study. And you'll see that the patterns do follow the predictions. The white participants did rate the tweets as less racist on average than the Black and Latinx participants. And this was true in every single study that we collected. This kind of analysis is often what's used as evidence that racial differences exist in perceptions of racism and a bunch of other issues. But I want to make this point. What would we learn if we focused on variation instead of these average comparisons? So to do this, we're going to use an analytic advance called the variance component analysis, or VCA, which quantifies where the rating variation is coming from using multi-level modeling. This helps estimate the relative amount of agreement to disagreement in the ratings. You can read about how they're calculated in my paper that's cited there, but I'm going to give you an intuition for what these variance components represent. So first up, we have the perceiver component, and this estimates differences between perceivers' overall average ratings. So some people, like the person on the right, might rate more of the tweets as racist than the person on the left. If there's variation between these participant means or perceiver means, that suggests that people are just using different parts of the scale more. And so what this really captures is a form of individual differences, which is a form of disagreement between people. So that's what this component estimates. The stimulus component in the middle estimates differences in the stimuli's overall average ratings. So some tweets, like the one on the right, are going to be perceived as more racist than other tweets like the one on the left. The only way that tweet averages could vary from each other in this way is if most perceivers agree on that difference, right? That this tweet is more racist than this other one. Otherwise, if people disagreed, then the averages of the tweets would actually collapse towards each other, towards the middle of the scale, actually. So what this component actually captures is agreement between people. If there's any variation here, you know people were agreeing. The final component is the perceiver by stimulus interaction. And this estimates differences between averages of combinations of perceivers and stimuli, as you can see on screen. It captures this very stable and idiosyncratic or unique way that you perceive a specific tweet that you don't share with other people and that you don't share with other tweets. So for example, you would rate your grandma's tweets very differently than tweets from strangers. And that's because you know your grandma, right? Those strangers don't know your grandma. So in the example here, the outlined person really doesn't think that outline tweet is racist. It's all the way on the left. Compared to the other tweet, the darker shaded tweet. Yet the other person who's here has the opposite ranking and sees both tweets as highly racist. So any variation that you see in these means represents unique disagreement between people, but at the level of the stimuli. So when there's more disagreement in your ratings overall, you should expect there to be more variation from the perceiver and interaction components, as I'm visually showing you here in bar graph form. But when there's more agreement in your ratings, you should expect to see more variance from the stimulus component and less from the other two, as you can see on screen. So what we're going to do is we're going to compute the VCA using the same rating data that I showed you before, the average comparisons, to see if there's more agreement or disagreement within racial categories. So first, let's look across the full sample. This is everyone's included in this analysis. And here you can think of the y-axis as the proportion of variance that's explained by each of these three components. So across the full sample, you can see that the largest component comes largest amount of variation comes from individual differences, which is a form of disagreement, followed by unique disagreement between people. And the smallest amount of variance comes from agreement. Now, this is to be expected, right? Everyone's mixed into this analysis, all the racial categories, like everyone's in here. So of course, there's going to be a ton of disagreement. So this is to be expected. Now let's look within each racial category. We should expect this blue stimulus bar to be much higher than the other two, because theoretically, right, there should be high agreement within racial categories. That race should cluster racism perceptions, that white people perceive racism in these tweets differently than the other categories. So this is what the VCA looked like in the Black participants, the Latinx participants, and the white participants. And I'm only showing you one plot because we got the same estimates in every single study that we ran. So I hope the story is very clear here. There is way more disagreement of various kinds than there is agreement within racial categories, even when there are average differences across them. These results show how average race differences do not necessarily reflect divergent racial group psychologies that are consensual and different from each other, right? There might be specific individuals that are driving these average differences. And I just want to note that this was studying immigration, but I did do a reanalysis of other studies who studied things like the shooting of Michael Brown and other contexts that you might consider to be like more obviously race related. And we found actually very similar patterns in those data too. So it's not just about the context that we studied here. So the choice to estimate average differences in the first place relates to the idea that races are real because we're trying to capture some central psychological tendencies of a racial population. But from a race anti-realist perspective, examining variation should be the default because we're grouping together people who might share a structural positioning, but ultimately live unique lives amidst these intersecting forces that are thrust upon them, right? And the important thing here is that we don't see these level of disagreements when we simply focus on comparing average differences, right? Another way to think about this is that those error bars that we see here, are not errors. There's meaningful variation that could actually change the conclusions you make about racial group psychologies, right? So what opportunities do we gain from shifting the focus of our analyses? Well, the first is that it can improve targeted interventions, right? If you wanted to design an intervention to get people to perceive racism in a similar way, based on the results I just talked about, to what extent would you intervene at the level of racialized groups versus maybe other clusters that better capture how racism perceptions are patterning across people? Or maybe even just you want to target in idiosyncratic psychology, right? What does each person uniquely understand and know about racism? And maybe that's where your intervention lies. It helps us explore variability, right? We're trained to analyze and prioritize averages in our theorizing as the best descriptors of reality. But there's important nuance to be gained from mapping out and exploring the variation that actually exists in the data. And finally, it gives us a chance to refuse race reification. Rather than sharing and publishing average analyses that imply that members of racialized groups must collectively perceive differently from each other, we can start discussing within group variation or how those groups are constructed in the context of your study. That's really important there. So I want to take a moment to clarify a few points because you're probably wondering what I am or am not implying about race, and I don't want people to put words in my mouth. So, am I implying that we should be eliminativists about race, meaning that we should just stop, if we just stop talking about race, if we just throw it out of our heads, that it's going to stop being a problem? No, not necessarily. I understand why researchers feel they need to measure race to show the outcomes of racism. For example, researchers who study racial disparities. I just think we need to be much more careful in how we're doing so. For instance, with sociological, large-scale data, unemployment, health, housing, carefully comparing race averages can show the consequences of racism. But when it comes to summarizing psychology, how people think, race averages might just mislead us when they're treated as entities in themselves rather than as products of racism. Am I implying that race is unimportant or has no impact on the world? Nope. The myth of race is the ideological core of racism. We need to understand it, we need to attack it. To the extent that race is seen or said to have an impact, I would actually attribute that impact instead to racism and racialization, which are real practices that spread beliefs in race. And it is through that spreading of that belief that, that racism has an impact on our lives. Am I implying that there's one right way to conceptualize race? Nah. I, like a variety in methodological and theoretical perspectives. I think that's a good thing. And if you read the literature, race theorists debate each other fiercely all the time. But some conceptions of race and how they're applied may have unintended negative consequences. So do I think we need to pivot how we currently think about and measure race? Yes. We really should be putting in the work to do harm reduction wherever and whenever we can. So that leads me to the final stop on the tour, which is the racecraft in our theories. So reading Racecraft got me questioning how I should talk about race without treating it as something that's real. It made me realize that a lot of the ways that we theorize and discuss race categories is groupist. We automatically think of them as purposive groups with shared interests, and then we take those presumed groupings for granted, as if they exist stably through time and space, as if they're discretely bounded, and as if the race category itself comprehensively explains people's thoughts, feelings, perceptions, how others are going to treat them, and why. This is one way that we end up reifying race. So our proposed solution in this paper that we published 2 years ago now is that we need context, right? Didn't fall out of a coconut tree. So what forces are creating the category and attaching it to people, right? What's making people form groupings around that category? And when and where does all of this racialization occur? So I want to talk about some frameworks, social constructionism, assemblage theory, dynamic systems, and we're going to go through an exercise to introduce very simply how these frameworks can contextualize social categories in ways that is non-essentialist. We're going to think about, as an exercise, what makes me an illegal? And I'm using illegality as an example because it has heavily informed my thinking on race, and I think this analogy is actually very productive. So, social constructionism in yellow is concerned with how language and discourses are used to regulate our experience and understanding of reality. So you might ask a social constructionist, how is halal and illegal? And they might look at things like institutional actions, right? What are the laws that displaced people and criminalized migrations? They might look at media, which can shape public perceptions of immigrants and link them to criminality. They might look at interpersonal dynamics, right? What are the features that lead people or officers to see me or label me as an illegal? Is it assumptions based on how I look, how I speak, who I'm around, where I live, like all of that stuff? So all of these symbols are impacting how I experience illegality because it's impacting how people are able to force it upon me, right? Assemblage theory in green talks about how physical matter is not just this passive and inanimate thing that we act upon, but it also acts upon us and helps co-create our experience and understanding of reality. Within assemblage theory, we can think of a category as manifesting from interactions between the matter around us and the discourses and languages and symbols, right? So if you studied this question from an assemblage theory perspective, you might look at things like material ID or documents, right? Where lacking them, I can feel like I'm in danger when I'm physically near officers or borders or concerned citizens looking for an illegal. I might look at the politics that emerge from the physical movement of bodies around borders, right? I can think about the technology and biometric algorithms that enable surveillance and capture us by datafying immigrants, right? I might look at the political economy, which has flows of desire and capital that extract profit from non-protected migrants. We might look at city infrastructure, right? Are there buildings to hide in if there's ICE raids around us? Can we find other illegalized immigrants for protection? Do we have access to immigration offices for appointments, or do we live too close to police departments and it just feels so risky to even just step outside, right? All of these materials play a role in the propagation of illegality and how I might experience it as I go through life. And finally, dynamic systems also helps us see how people are embedded in a tangled web of environments that are mutually reinforcing. Within dynamic systems, we can think of a category not as something someone is, but as an environment that people inherit, inhabit, and change. So from a dynamic systems perspective, I might study how I'm an illegal by looking at underground economies, right? Illegalized immigrants are not supposed to work, but the big secret is that we do, and we get paid under the table. And these under the table working creates informal economic safety nets amongst ourselves, which opens up ways of living beyond the imposed rules of illegality, right? I might look at things like activism and DACA, which attempt to decriminalize the immigrant in some ways. And it creates semi-legal statuses within illegality and even moralized statuses, right? Like the good versus bad immigrant stories. So in some ways we become formally incorporated into society, and in other ways we don't. But then, of course, because it's a dynamic system, we can then look at the pushback to activism, which attempts to then further recriminalize. For example, we can think about ICE raids or changing the scope of who's eligible for deportation or protections, which all of it is shifting with time and political projects and affects how I experience illegality. But the bottom line here is that how all of these elements combine to create illegality, to attach it to me, and to shape what I can do in this world, and how it shapes my psychology, all of that is going to ebb and flow with time and world events. Although illegality is more obviously an imposed status, it makes these dynamics really easy to see. The same maps can actually be created for race categories: Black, white, Latino, whatever category you want to examine. So a challenge for psychology will be then to figure out how can we account for all of these dynamics within our science? Because right now our simple, race category identity measures are missing all of this context. What's behind the category, what's creating the category. I'm gonna skip this. Actually, no, I'm not. So while it would seem that we would need to develop, large scale scope sociological methods to capture these dynamics, and maybe we should as social psychologists, constructions can be captured using experimental methods. For example, in this study, we presented people with immigrants from various countries that were associated with stories that we collected from various sources. In one condition, the criminal narratives we collected were from Donald Trump's immigrant crime list that he was putting out in 2017. In another condition, we collected achievement narratives from the immigrant excellence hashtag that we created on Twitter that people were able to share their stories on, and so on. We also had struggle narratives that we developed. We had participants rate each immigrant on 7 traits, as you can see here: American, competent, competitive, dangerous, lazy, moral, and unsociable. And what we did is the ratings were treated as vectors that represented each immigrant here. And what we did is we correlated the trait vectors for each pair of immigrants. This correlation tells us how similar people are thinking about Hans and Nikolai here, right? The pairwise correlation then gets inserted into the similarity matrix that has each immigrant on the row and each immigrant on the column. What the similarity matrix tells us is how similar each immigrant is represented to every other immigrant in this trait space. This similarity matrix can then be analyzed to see how people are mentally organizing all these immigrants when they're criminals or when they're achieving or struggling. So one possibility could be that people think of nationality groups and their relations in a stable way. And so these simple story changes shouldn't change those relationships, right? Nikolai is similar to Hans, no matter whether they're criminals together or achieving together, right? But instead, what we found is this. So I'm going to show you a multidimensional scaling plot. Here, the axes are not interpretable, so don't think about that. But what is interpretable is how similar or far apart each immigrant is to every other immigrant. Here, each kind of dot or triangle or whatever is an immigrant. And they're labeled by their country of origin. So Mexico, Syria, Germany, and Russia. And it turns out that achievement narratives in green create very homogenized representations. All achieving immigrants are represented as similar to each other, no matter what their country of origin is, right? On the other hand, criminal and struggling narratives create these very differentiated representations. All the immigrants are kind of treated as very different from each other. But that's not only the thing that happened. They were also racialized by nationality. So you could see above this line, if you only look at the blue and the red, you could see that that's where Germany and Russia are in this trait space. And below that line is where Mexico and Syria are. So these criminal and struggling narratives are creating these racialized representations in our minds. So the important point here is that media narratives can shift people's schemas of immigrant groups and their relationships to each other. The meanings of each nationality group are not self-contained. They are constructions, social constructions, dependent on what other nationality groups and political discourses are activated in the moment. So the insights you should take away here is that it's the context-specific features, the processes of how and why social significance is placed on them and by whom, and the consequences of being perceived to have those features that can better explain the impact of categories on psychological experience than just having the categories themselves, as a lot of psychology papers do. We treat categories as the explanations, when actually the categories themselves need to be explained first. So this ends our Racecraft tour, but earlier I asked what a race anti-realist social psychology could look like. So I want to explore this question with a case study using my dissertation research back in the day. And I'm going to walk through how we can think about the study design, the analysis, and the theoretical inferences, given what we now know about race and Racecraft. So for this project, I asked, what do people think illegalized immigrants look like? And how is illegality visually encoded into those mental representations? So I'm going to first present the basic design and results. To capture these visual mental representations people might hold, we use reverse correlation. Here's how it works. You start out with the base face, and this is an important part of the study design, because the base face is going to constrain what kind of faces you can eventually get from the participants. So you start out with the base face, and what you do is you superimpose random noise over this image hundreds of times, so that you end up with these face stimuli. And you could see that, the features of the base face change a little bit depending on where the light and dark patches of noise fall upon the face. Once you have these stimuli, you can put them into a classification task where you ask people who looks more like an undocumented immigrant. People will do this task, hundreds of trials. You take all of the faces they selected, you average out the noise pattern, and you end up with this classification image. So this was the face that each participant produced. That ostensibly kind of represents what they think undocumented immigrants look like. So this is a data-driven way to find out what features, facial features, people are using to visually construct illegality in their minds. So what we did is we had Princeton students visualize one of three different conditions: US citizens, documented immigrants, and undocumented immigrants. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you the average representations these students created for each of the conditions. And just to remind you, these faces, okay, so this is the representation for US citizen. Here it is for documented immigrants. And here it is for undocumented immigrants. And just to remind you, these faces were made out of the same base face above, right? All three of these came from that base face. So clearly, different documentation statuses evoke differently racialized imagery in people through features like skin color and facial expressions, like emotional expressions. So now that we know the basics of this project, I'm going to point out some areas where Racecraft could occur. One is in the study design. How is this base face chosen? One is in the analysis. Should we trust this average face as the representation of illegality? And one is in the theoretical inferences. How should we interpret what kind of undocumented immigrant this face is supposed to represent? So, starting with the study design, the choice of the base face in these kinds of studies is very important because it's, like I said earlier, it's going to constrain what kind of representations you can capture. So how do we choose the best face to capture illegality? Research shows that people associate illegality with immigration from Mexico, from Syria, from Central America, from Africa. So one possibility from a race realist perspective would have been, hey, we need Latinx faces, we need Black faces, we need Middle Eastern faces. But this is where Racecraft can creep in, because phenotypic variation exists within all of those categories I just mentioned. So what we did is we took a different approach. We chose to morph faces that had a diversity of facial features, lighter to darker skin, different shaped noses, eyes, and hair, and so on. And the idea was that if the base face was made up of faces with diverse physical features, no matter what their supposed race was supposed to be, it could actually capture a bigger range of mental representations, enough to be able to capture illegality. And this actually seemed to work. In another paper, what we did is examine how nationality and economic status affects representations of illegality. And you can see that using the same base face as I just showed you here, this base face allowed participants to create all of these different representations, where you could see the largest visual differences are by nationality, which are the rows here. Connor, the Irish person, looks very different from Jose, who looks very different from Lee. So in line with this constructionist approach I'm trying to get people to think about, focusing on facial features rather than just assuming that we need to collect faces from different racial categories enabled us to examine racialization without having to a priori pick racial groups based on how we expected them to look. Obviously, this is not a faultless method. We're limited by what face databases are available. Here, we use the London face database to study illegality in the United States. But we know that facial features do vary by geography, and geography is one ingredient that's used for racialization. So if we had used a base face, if we had used faces to morph into the base face that were more regionally located in the Americas, we maybe could have captured a wider range of representations beyond what we did here. Focusing on the analysis, should we trust this average face that is computed as the representation of illegality? In other words, does everyone visualize the same face, same face when they're thinking about illegality? If not, then this average face is an incomplete part of the story and can become an overgeneralized caricature of illegality, which becomes racecraft, right? Like when we publish our papers, we often just publish the average faces, and that's an issue. So when I first started this project, there was no method available to scrutinize or analyze reverse correlation average images, right? Like how do we know if they're valid or so on? So I actually had to develop an analytic pipeline for mapping variation in mental representations. It actually uses machine learning and clustering techniques to find clusters of these face representations that are similar. And then we try to identify any kind of variables, individual differences, et cetera, that can help us explain why those clusters look the way they do. Here's quickly how it works. We first take each person's representation, which is the noise pattern that they selected as they did the task, those hundreds of trials. And we turn that noise vector into a vector of pixel intensities. We do this for each participant. So we have each participant's representation, and then you correlate across all those vector representations. So that's why you end up with this correlation matrix, with this how similar each participant's representation is to every other participant. Then what you can do is you can insert this matrix into any kind of clustering algorithm that you find useful. In my case, I decided to use hierarchical clustering, which we can, for many different reasons you can read about in the paper. But the clusters are then validated by, the clusters create these average face images, and these average face images are then validated by linking to individual difference measures, or having the average face that is produced by each cluster is kind of evaluated on different trait ratings to see what the content of that face really is. So what we did is we collected over 1,000 representations from people in California and Texas using the same base face as before. And here's the overall average face across those thousands of people. And you'll notice that it's very similar to the Princeton students' average face that they produced. So that could actually, that could suggest everyone does have the same kind of face, right? Like these Princeton students created it, but so did these Texas and California people. But when I apply my pipeline, one possibility could be that there's very little variation, right? As suggested by these average faces, right? It could be that it's just one big giant cluster that's very similar to this average. Everyone just has the same face in mind. But what I found instead is that there are meaningful subclusters hiding behind this average. Some clusters were highly shared, suggesting that maybe there's a widespread source for those clusters, like maybe the media is producing this image for people. Other clusters were differentiated by things like age and social geography. So younger people and those who perceived more undocumented or illegalized immigrants in their neighborhoods were more likely to belong to clusters with less threatening and more phenotypically varied representations. And the opposite was true for older participants and those who perceive, less immigrants in their neighborhoods. So by focusing on variation, we could see much easier that context plays a role in the visual encoding of illegality in people's minds, which we would really miss by just focusing on the average as we typically do. And finally, how should we interpret what this face represents, right? Reverse correlation tasks usually answer that by having these faces rated. So that's what we did. We collected race ratings of the face. On the y-axis here, you could see various ethno-racial categories. On the x-axis is the likelihood that the space was perceived to belong to each of these categories. And you'll see here that the face was perceived as most likely to be Black, a little bit of maybe everything else, and least likely to be a white person. So a common practice in my field is to say that people visualize Black people when they're thinking of an illegalized immigrant based on these results. That should give us pause now that we know about Racecraft, right? We know that Mexicans can be dark-skinned, as can immigrants from many other countries, many which might not consider themselves Black. We didn't ask the face visualizers to racially classify who they visualized. So the only evidence we have that this face is supposed to be a Black person is of third-party raters. So I need to recognize that I don't have the grounds to say this visualization is meant to represent a Black person's face. Instead, I have to contextualize my interpretation. I could say something like, sorry, this is what people would typically say, that this is a Black person or Black face in publications. To contextualize instead, I would say something like, my participants visualized a darker skinned face that is perceived as Black by some percentage of raters. Describing the results in this different way helps us be more specific about what kind of racism is at play in representations of illegality. It's the visual logics of colorism, which is something that would get downplayed if we simply interpreted the face exclusively in terms of racial categories. So another point to make here is that this kind of contextualization in our publications is good meta science. Will these faces be perceived as Black or white, etc., for future readers of our papers? We don't know. So providing this context now ensures that we're not projecting our current assumptions into the future. So we can see how contextualizing our interpretations of our data in these faces can really minimize Racecraft. In other words, we need more context, right? So this Racecraft tour was necessarily incomplete. All the methods and ideas I showed are just the beginning of this conversation. And I'm hoping more people will take up this lens and continue to change psychology's practices, because as researchers, we have an ethical responsibility to carefully consider the classifications that we reinforce in society and the consequences that they produce. This is especially important. I hope people take up this mantle because I'm not there to continue this work. But I am available for contact. So if these ideas interest you and you want to talk about them and you want to push them forward, please let me know. And of course, this is what I had planned to do in my future directions if I had stayed in academia. But that's something that I'll leave out for now. So I just want to thank anyone who watched this video. The citations for all of the papers that I presented are on the screen. They might be old. Let me just check. Yeah, some of these might change as they get published. So you can go to my website that's listed on the page, and you can find the most up-to-date access to the papers. And the last point I just want to make is just please read Racecraft, read beyond your field. Read more than what you think you need to read, and let these insights carry your imaginations forward, because I think we need more creativity in our field. Thank you.